Hello, my name's Ben. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you about this work on audio synthesizer inversion, conducted with my co-authors Saitis and György Fazekas. So these days, music and audio professionals rely on a highly developed ecosystem of parametric production tools like audio effects and synthesizers. And our work is motivated by the question, can we use machine learning to enhance and integrate with these tools? For now, we focus on a task called sound matching, in which we have an audio synthesizer and an audio signal, and we want to find the synthesizer parameters that best approximate that audio. Historically, these tasks have been approached with costly black box optimizers that require many calls to the synthesizer, and so the hope was that deep learning would allow us to avoid this cost. But in practice, neural networks have struggled to deliver results. This is surprising, given what we know neural networks can do. Inverting a deterministic black box should not really be so difficult, so why do they turn out to be so bad at this task? Well, spoiler alert, they're not. We've just been taking the wrong approach to training them. So what do I mean by that? To understand, we should think about the forward map that a synthesizer represents. So for a given synth, there's a space of possible parameter configurations from which we can select an example. We pass this through the synthesizer to produce an output in the space of audio signals. No surprises so far, but very often, a synthesizer can produce the same signal given multiple different parameter inputs. And this is the important point. The forward map is many to one, and so the inverse problem is ill-posed. One signal can correspond to multiple different parameter configurations. So why does this matter? Well, let's strip away some complexity for a moment and just make a very simple model. So our forward model is now simply y equals x squared. And we're going to sample a data set of x, y pairs. And we want to use these to train a network to regress x, given y as input. And the problem, as you can see on the right, is that x squared is invariant under sign change. If we don't deal with this symmetry, a sufficiently large model will converge on something like the crazy orange interpolant, while a smaller model will be forced to average conflicting solutions, like in the green line. Even worse, the usual options we have in deep learning, like collecting more data or scaling up our model, actually make this problem worse. So how does this many-to-one issue actually manifest in audio synthesizers? Well, sometimes we can arrive at the same output using entirely different ways of programming a synthesizer. So an oscillator and a resonant digital filter can both produce a sine wave. Sometimes the value of one parameter prevents other parameters from influencing the signal at all. So in the most extreme case, we could just turn the global output level to 0, and then any value of the other parameters results in an identical silent signal. And finally, we sometimes find that synthesizers exhibit structural symmetries. So for example, if we have multiple functionally equivalent oscillators operating in parallel, our synthesizer is invariant to permutations of their parameters. And previous approaches to sound matching have trained networks to produce point estimates of parameters using regression or DDSP objectives. And these are minimized by the expectation over equivalent solutions, which, if we have multiple conflicting ground truths, is of course suboptimal. So what if instead we explicitly represent our uncertainty by modeling a distribution over possible solutions? In fact, all we really need to do is sample from it, so we're simply training a generative model. And as we shall see, this turns out to work a lot better. But if we know already that some of the uncertainty comes from structural symmetry, why don't we also take advantage of this knowledge? We could do so by constraining our model to learn distributions which are invariant to the synthesizer's symmetries, meaning that we assign exactly the same probability to each symmetric outcome. And this means we don't spend any model capacity on these symmetries, and we can focus instead on other sources of uncertainty. To implement this in practice, we adopt the continuous normalizing flow family of generative models because the theory guarantees us that if we implement them with a symmetry equivariant architecture, we learn a symmetry invariant density. Here we focus on permutation symmetries, which we do with a diffusion transformer, which when used without a positional encoding is naturally permutation equivariant. In the ideal case, there would be an obvious mapping from synthesizer parameters to transformer tokens, like for an additive synthesizer, we would assign the parameters of each oscillator to an individual token. But such a simple mapping is not always available. In fact, we often don't know exactly which symmetries are even present in a synthesizer. In the case of complex real-world black box synthesizers, for example, we can only really guess at which symmetries there are and which parameters they act on. Synthesizers also sometimes exhibit quasi-symmetric structure, for example, symmetries that only exist conditionally on the values of certain other parameters. So to accommodate these cases, we designed a module which allows adaptive discovery of the appropriate equivariance-preserving mapping from parameters to tokens during training. So to determine how much of an effect these issues of ill-posedness and symmetry really have, we designed a toy task that uses a simple additive synthesizer. The synth consists of k identical oscillators whose outputs are summed together, making it naturally permutation invariant. However, if we want, we can break the symmetry by limiting each oscillator to a different frequency range. And this means we can isolate the effect of symmetry on any models we train on the task. So let's look at some results. We focus here on the log spectral distance between ground truth and resynthesized audio. The pink line is a worst-case baseline produced by just randomly sampling parameters. The first thing to look at is the standard regression model, which is representative of previous sound matching approaches. When there's no symmetry in the synthesizer, this performs very well. However, if we introduce a permutation symmetry, this dramatically harms its performance. Next, we look at our permutation equivariant generative model, where each token represents an oscillator. When the synthesizer has the corresponding symmetry, it performs very well. But when we break the symmetry, the performance becomes very poor. This is because the equivariance is overly restrictive, and the model can't differentiate between oscillators. But when we use our parameter-to-token mapping, under symmetric conditions, it behaves just like the fully equivariant model and uses its inductive bias to achieve very good performance. But under asymmetric conditions, it's capable of breaking this bias and ignoring the inappropriate symmetry constraint, and thus also performs very well. We can get a visual intuition for this by computing the cosine similarities between the learned parameter embeddings of the parameter token module. So on the left, for the permutation symmetric synthesizer, it has learned the functional equivalence between the permutable oscillators, and so the representations for all frequency parameters are almost identical, and the same goes for amplitude and waveform. On the right, with no symmetry, the learned representations lack this structure. So we see that unresolved symmetry really does harm the performance of deterministic regression models, while our equivariant generative approach does much better, lending strong support to our parameter indeterminacy hypothesis. On the other hand, it's also clear that inappropriate model equivariance harms performance, and this is why our parameter-to-token model is helpful. It allows us to benefit from equivariance where necessary without imposing hard constraints. Okay, so toy experiments are good, but we're really interested in actual synthesizers. So we applied our techniques to a full-featured professional-grade synthesizer called SurgeXT, which also happens to be open source and free to download. And here we find that across a suite of audio reconstruction metrics, our proposed generative approaches drastically outperform the previous state-of-the-art. Again, we can visualize the learned parameter embeddings by looking at their cosine similarities, obviously now a lot more complicated, and we can see patterns of self-similarity and repeated structure between equivalent synthesizer modules. So here I'm highlighting the relationships between oscillators, here the relationships between LFOs. So to wrap up, I'll play a couple of audio examples. So firstly, these sounds are generated by randomly sampling the parameter space of the synthesizer, so they're not pretty or nice to listen to, but they do illustrate the level of fine-grained audio complexity a model has to deal with to succeed at this task. And while we didn't explicitly train our models for out-of-distribution audio, we did nonetheless evaluate on some other data sets to lay a foundation for future work. And here are a couple of examples of these outputs. Now, bear in mind that these are produced entirely with an audio synthesizer with a neural network that's only ever seen audio from this synthesizer. So to conclude, we found that neural networks are, in fact, very effective at inferring audio synthesizer parameters when trained under the appropriate generative framework while respecting synthesizer symmetries. If you want more complete results on our method, please come visit our physical or virtual poster. Otherwise, thanks very much for your attention. Cheers.